Our Old Testament reading this week comes from the book of 1 Kings. I read from the 19th chapter, beginning in the 9th verse. At that place, Horeb, Elijah came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Amen. Ours is a culture of how-tos. We love 8 simple steps with corresponding pictures and a toll-free number to call if we mess it up. If you Google the words "how to," the autofill function will tell you what they think you want to ask. And they suggest that perhaps you mean to finish your sentence in one of the following ways. How to tie a tie. How to boil eggs. How to hard-boiled eggs. I don't know why there's a difference between those two. How to get rid of ants. How to get rid of fruit flies. How to remove a tick. Apparently insects are big on the internet. How to cut a mango. How to make French toast. And for the fans of the children's movie, How to Train Your Dragon. Mostly very practical, some a little odd, but things that are pretty functional, pretty hands-on. But add one word and things get interesting. If you type in "how not to" into Google, the autofill suggests that perhaps you want to search one of the following. How not to be wrong. How not to be boring. How not to be clingy. How not to cry. How not to be jealous. How not to be lazy. How not to be nervous. And my personal favorite, how not to kill your husband. Now, also the name of a TV show, but also good advice. I thought it was fascinating how many of these how not tos are more likely to be emotional or relational. We want simple steps in everything in life, including some of the most complex relational and emotional things that we deal with. Now, not to be outdone by Google, I thought I would make my own how not to list this morning. It is inspired from the pages of 1 Kings and the passage I read a few moments ago. The Bible's filled with heroines and heroes for us to emulate, but today I hold up to you the example of the prophet Elijah and how not to listen to God. In 4 simple and obvious steps today, you will discover in the next 20 minutes what not to do if you want to hear God's voice. The first simple and obvious step, listening to God, is not a simple or obvious process. In other words, how not to listen to God: expect God's voice to be loud and clear and evident. Just like our Google searches for a simple solution to these complex emotional and relational topics, we run into trouble, don't we, when we think that 8 simple steps will lock us in to God's voice. Elijah speaks to this truth. He was coming off a time when his life, when faith was easy, when it was clear. He and God together had just rained down fire from heaven, defeated the prophets of Baal. At his fingertips, the very power of God had been evident. His victory was complete. The clarity with which God spoke was crystal, but not anymore. Now Elijah was alone and afraid, and his method to try to make sense of the world was to recreate the mountaintop again. So he did it by emulating one of the most important mountaintop experiences in all of Hebrew history, the event in which Moses received the 10 Commandments. Moses had gone to the top of Mount Sinai, so Elijah went to the top of Mount Sinai, also known as Horeb. Moses had gone to receive a word from the Lord, so Elijah went to receive a word from the Lord. Moses had seen the presence of God passing by, so Elijah hoped to see the presence of God passing by. But here's the problem. God didn't show up. At least not in the majesty and simplicity that Elijah expected. There was an earthquake. God was not in the earthquake. There was a fire from heaven. God was not in the fire. There was a great wind. God was not in the wind. But then there came what the New Revised Standard calls the sound of sheer silence. A silence so palpable it was as if it actually made a sound. And that is where the voice of God resounded. Because God's voice is not always in the obvious or the grandiose. In fact, it rarely is. Christian writers and mystics over the years have pointed out the fact that when we hear God, it's often in the quietness. When we are still long enough to listen, not in the majestic and the miraculous, but in the solitude and silences of our lives. Quaker spiritualist Douglas Steer writes this, speaking of tiny promptings and gentle whispers. He describes the life of faith in this way. He says, if we are sensitive and listening, there comes clear insights of things to be done. Often they come in that receptive, silent waiting after we have opened our needs and where we do nothing but wait for direction. They may come during the day and push their way in between events that seem to bear no connection with them. These insights are precious and need to be heeded if we are to live in response to that which we feel in prayer. Powerful words for one who has taken the time to listen. If we are to hear these insights in and for our lives, we look to the silences, not just to the grandiose. So step 1 in how not to listen to God. Expect God's voice to be loud and clear and obvious. It is a surefire way to be disappointed. Step 2, how not to listen to God. Be sure to listen to all the voices of negativity in your life. It's an excellent way to miss what God is actually saying. Elijah found himself on the mountain because he was on the run from Ahab and Jezebel. They were not entirely happy that Elijah had just defeated all of their prophets, so they swore vengeance on him. Even if it was the last thing they did, they would kill him. These were the voices ringing in Elijah's ears as he came to the mountain and came to the cave. Voices of negativity and vengeance. Read again the words that he said. The enemies of God are after me, and I am alone. He was paralyzed by fear. Now, as we read the context, as we read the larger passage, we see that he was not alone. He had plenty of allies on his side, but that's the way paralyzing fear works, doesn't it? It's not a rational thing. Counselors will often use the phrase, emotions are not facts. But how often do we treat them as if they were? How often do we listen to the voices in the middle of the night in our heads that tell us how to behave or what to feel? They feel so real and so terrifying and so palpable. But they are not facts and they are not rational truths. But that does not mean that they are not real. It does not mean that they are not powerful. So today I ask you to look at your life and answer the question, who is your Ahab? Who is your Jezebel? Who are the voices of negativity and fear and helplessness that ring in your ears? Is it the voice of your father or mother who never believed that you were going to live up to their expectations anyway? Is it that ex-husband or ex-wife whose justification for leaving the marriage was to eviscerate and to blame you? Is it the boss or coworker who never speaks a positive word about your performance or your ability? Is it the quote-unquote friend who is always judging, always questioning your judgment, always cutting you down? Who is your Jezebel? Who is your Ahab? Whose voice are you listening to instead of God's? Elijah could not hear the facts and realities of his life because he was overwhelmed by fear. He could not listen to the voice of God because he was spending too much time and too much energy listening to the negative voices that surrounded him. One of the best ways for us to miss the voice of God is to be drowned out by the other voices of negativity and fear. So, step 2, how not to listen to God. Choose the chorus of negativity. It'll always be there, instead of choosing the grace and hope of God. Step 3, how not to listen to God. Be sure to do the same thing over and over again, even if it's not working. Look again at this pattern that Elijah engages in. So he's on the run from Jezebel and Ahab. He runs off and hides in this cave. And he hears the voice of God saying, "Why are you here?" Elijah answers, just like any stereotypical teenage daughter on any show produced by the Disney Channel in the last 20 years. "Well, because everyone hates me, even though I'm just trying to do the right thing, and I had to run off and hide in this cave, and now I'm the only one left, and everyone's trying to kill me." What does God do in response? Go to the edge of the cave and listen. Elijah comes to the end of the cave. He listens and sees the wind and the earthquake and the fire, and then God asks again, "Why are you here?" And Elijah's response is exactly the same thing. "Well, everyone hates me, even though I'm just trying to do the right thing, and I had to run off and hide in this cave, and now everyone's trying to kill me, and I'm just the only one left." The exact same words. How often do we do the same things in our life? The same patterns, the same expectations. Nothing has changed, but we expect a different result. God had just shown up and spoken to Elijah, but it had no effect on him. Of course, we can be a little judgmental, can't we? How often do we get stuck in the same patterns? We do the same thing again and again and again and expect a different result. For Elijah, he already had it in his mind that he was a victim. Nothing that God said was going to change that. It didn't matter what God said, because Elijah's God, Elijah's little g God, was this pattern of helplessness, and that is who he heard. So if we want to miss God's voice of transformation and change and hope, be sure to get stuck in patterns of hopelessness and helplessness. Do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. Step 4, how not to listen to God. You need to expect God to coddle you. How often do we fail to hear God's voice because we fail to hear God telling us what we want God to tell us? We're only listening to God to tell us what will make our life easier, what's most convenient for us, the answers for which we are longing. What if? God's gentle leading is more often about how to help others and not just how to help ourselves. For Elijah, when he finally did listen, when he did finally discern the voice of God, his message was a very clear one. He was to be a sending prophet. His marching orders were not to call down fire from God, nor was it to command 1,000 armies from the Lord, but it was to empower others to do the work of God. Look at his to-do list again. Anoint a new king of Aram, anoint a new king of Israel, and anoint a new prophet, Elisha, to take his place. All examples of empowering others. How often is our call the same? God is telling us there is work to be done, and it takes a listening spirit to discern what that work is. Again, it's the Quaker Steer who explains that prayer is what he calls an incipient action. It is the beginning of a life of response, the dawning of a life of service to others, the first step of the work of God. He explains that listening to God in prayer opens the door to what God is calling us to do and to be. Hear these words from Steer. Here's the unformed side of life's relationships, the letters to be written, the friends to be visited, the journey to be undertaken, the suffering to be met by food or nursing care or fellowship. Here's the social wrong to be resisted, the piece of interpretive work to be undertaken, the command to rebuild my churches, the article to be written, the wrong to be forgiven, the grudge to be dropped, the relationship to be set right, the willingness to serve God in the interior courts by clear, honest thinking, and the refusal to turn out shoddy work. Powerful words. A reminder that prayer is the beginning of action. So today I ask, who is God calling you to serve, to care for, to pray for, to fight for justice for? Maybe there is an Elisha out there who needs to be empowered and encouraged. Maybe there is a future king that needs to be anointed by your words and your support. Maybe there is someone who needs us to stop whining about our own problems and focus on the needs of others. Now, I'm not saying we should never pray for ourselves. But sometimes when we think our life is so difficult and we're dealing with so much and we are hurting so badly, what God is really saying is to stop spending so much time focusing on our problems and begin opening our lives and opening our hands and opening our hearts to how we can serve others. Sure, it sounds harsh, but it seems that God does not have the desire to coddle prophets who sit in caves and whine about their own problems. God is calling us to something greater. God is calling us to something bigger. God may well be asking you here today, why are you here? I want you to be here. I want you to be there. I want you to be out. I want you to be doing the work of God in your life, in your family, at your workplace, with your friends. I want you to be out doing the work of empowering others and speaking the truth in love. I want you to leave the cave and go into the world. Of course, we can come up with plenty more reasons and plenty more ways to not listen to the voice of God, but when we sit in silence and when we hear that voice, are we ready? God has somewhere for you to be. God has somewhere for me to be. God has somewhere for us to be. Let's wrap the mantles around our faces and get to the journey and get to work. Let us pray. God, for the work of your call, the work of your mission, the work of your Son, we are thankful to hear that work. Ask for wisdom and ask for clarity, but most of all, ask for strength and encouragement as we go about that work this day and the days ahead. In your name we pray. Amen.